Welcome to a brand new wave, drowning out the noise that's tame. Liberty whispers through the brave, breaking free from every chain. Nullify the rules they crave, crypto beats that pave the way. Anarchy with minds that's safe, algorithms new dawn today. Out of bounds and out of sight, building futures pure and bright. Escape the grip and win the fight. Welcome into the legacy ride. Beyond control we take a stand, casting off the iron brand. Freedom flowing through our hands, revolution's our command. Decentralize the way we plan, all together we expand. Breaking shackles for the clan, in this journey we're unpanned. Out of bounds and out of sight, building futures pure and bright. Escape the grip and win the fight. Welcome into the legacy ride.
Welcome to the Legacy Right, Legacy News, episode 30. Crypto Wednesday is at it again. Let me fix that a little bit so you can see me a little bit better. I am the legacy of Jennifer and Kaiser, and we got another one for you. Breaking Monero, the series that we're going to be following for a lot of Wednesdays. So stay tuned and let's dive in and learn the basics of cryptocurrency, the blockchain, and privacy and centralization, and what Monero and other privacy assets on the blockchain have to offer. Welcome in there, Andrew Joseph.
Hey, what's going on?
Not much, man. On this Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, almost daylight savings in about a month. A little less than a month, actually. March
That's
9th.
If they don't change things up in Congress.
They're not changing shit. So they're not going to change anything. If anything, I don't know. Before we jump into it. Speaking of daylight savings, since we brought it up, if they were to finally get us off of this garbage, would you prefer them to make daylight savings time the standard, or would you like to stay on standard? That would mean one more daylight saving, one more rolling the clock forward before, and then November we just stay the same.
Oh man, I prefer standard. Personally,
I prefer UTC, Universal Time, because the rest of the world is on UTC.
Socialist.
Honestly, it makes a lot more sense. Actually, who cares if it's 12 o'clock here in Indiana and 8 o'clock in England and it's pitch black, I don't care. Who gives a shit? I want to talk to my I want to be able to talk to my friends overseas
Are you implying it's
on the
5
same
o'clock
time.
somewhere?
It's always 5 o'clock somewhere. Also, yeah, that way you can crack open a beer at 5 p.m. and everybody else is cracking open a beer at 5 p.m. unless they're sleeping, which
It's a
most
great
likely
big
they've been
world, isn't
sleeping.
it?
It's a great big world. It's a great big world that we have yet to explore. And speaking of that, there's so many possibilities in this world. And one such possibility is the blockchain. It's effective technology to break the mold and the hold of centralized oligarchical
Monopoly.
whips and chains. I was going to say whips and chains because it feels like whips and chains. She was in the whips and chains. I was in the pain.
See, this is the kind of stuff that I have to put up with.
You've never listened to David Allen Coe? Man, you
I'm
live under a
talking about
rock.
you.
Hilarious.
I'm talking about co-hosts like you. But come on,
I'm
let's
the
get.
captain, dude. I am the captain. So
Oh,
number
okay.
one, or I should say my number two, let's drop that video. Let's drop that
All right.
video for
Are we all
cliffhanger.
ready? God help us all.
Welcome
Go.
to the second episode of Breaking Monero. Breaking Monero is a series of episodes where we explain the limitations of Monero's security and privacy in a comprehensive and understandable way. Today, we are covering an introduction to ring signatures and their history. It's important to understand ring signatures before talking about really anything else in this episode's series because they all really build off ring signatures, or at least to do for the most part. But before we get there, we have Sarang on here, and I would, Sarang, can you introduce yourself really briefly? I know hopefully they saw you in the previous episode, but can you also cover some basic terms for some people, the idea of plausible deniability and the idea of heuristics?
Yeah, so like you said, I go by Sarang Noether, and I'm one of the researchers, PhD researchers who works on Monero research and development on behalf of the Monero Research Lab. My counterpart being Sarang Noether, who's not able to be here today, but was on the previous episode to talk about a little bit about introduction to the series and why we're doing what we're doing. So ring signatures are a topic that come up a lot, and as we're going to talk about later and in future episodes, I would say they're kind of the pain point and the sticking point for issues that people have with Monero, and one of the things that we've had to deal with iteratively over time in order to strengthen Monero for people. So in this episode, like you had said, we're going to kind of go over just a very brief overview of kind of the structure of how they work. We won't go into the mathematics. There are definitely good resources if you're really interested in that. But we're going to talk a bit about their structure and kind of lead into later on why that structure can lead to some problems. To kind of start out with, the sky is not falling, ring signatures are not broken, whatever that means. As we're going to talk about, they do exactly what they say in the box, but they end up leading to, I would say, annoyances and things that we try to iteratively improve on. So you had mentioned the phrase plausible deniability. And that's a phrase that we sometimes use when we talk about Monero's sender ambiguity. And I wish it was a phrase that was used more often, because as we talked about before, people like to throw around words like private and fungible when they really don't have any formal meanings. We have intuitive things for what we assume private or fungible mean in terms of a digital asset, but it's kind of tough to nail them down exactly. So I like to kind of branch out Monero's privacy and anonymity guarantees into three parts: sender ambiguity, or privacy if you want to call it that, recipient ambiguity or privacy, and kind of amount and or metadata privacy. So in general, receiver anonymity and amount anonymity, or amount metadata, you might say, are in general very, very good. So what happens is when you choose to send funds to someone with Monero, and they're not directly linked to your wallet address. I have one or more Monero wallets for which there are addresses. I can receive funds addressed to those, and I can use funds addressed to those to later send to other people. So Justin has a wallet address, he gives it to me, and then I, somehow send funds to that using my Monero client. But what happens is the wallet address itself, that if I'm sending funds to Justin, never actually appears on the blockchain. That's huge. Instead, what happens is I effectively generate kind of a one-time, we call it an output or note address sometimes, depending on who you ask. And that one-time address is what actually appears on the blockchain. So wallet addresses never appear there. It's an important fact to keep in mind. There's a difference between those, and it's kind of a subtle difference that's easy to miss from time to time. But the idea is when you're sending funds to someone, the recipient, their wallet address is never known. I basically kind of bake that recipient address into the one-time address in a way that's not reversible. So someone looking at an output that I generate that's destined to Justin, no one can tell that it's destined to Justin. Justin's knowledge of the private key that corresponds to his wallet address allows him to later spend those funds, but he can't directly determine anything about that address. Similarly, as I think we may have mentioned in the last episode, things like the amount of the transaction, those used to be known in Monero for various reasons, but now those are basically kind of tied up in what's called a cryptographic commitment, and that's what led into the whole idea of like range proofs and bullet proofs. That was a big point of discussion before, but that's also very, very good. So the amount of your transaction is private, the recipient of your transaction is private, but we often like to talk about sender ambiguity, and that's where ring signatures come into play. So effectively, if I'm sending funds to Justin, I would have to take some funds that I had previously received in a so-called one-time output that was destined to me, and I don't want to just necessarily send those to him. In another alternate version of Monero, perhaps, maybe you could do that. Where I take that output one-time address and I basically sign it over to Justin in some sense. Effectively, what I'm really doing is I'm generating a new output one-time address, and I'm basically signing for it using the one that I had received. And when done properly, this can assure everyone that the money existed before and that I controlled it and that nothing funny happened. But effectively, in Monero, we want to obfuscate that even more using plausible deniability. So what I do is I basically take that one-time output address, you might want to say, that was destined to me that I wish to actually spend to Justin. But I'm also going to take a bunch of other random, and random can mean many things to different people, but I effectively take other one-time addresses that I don't control. Now, unlike things like CoinJoin or other mixers, I don't need to actually collaborate or cooperate with anyone to do this. They have no knowledge of what I'm doing, and that's an important part of this. I basically take other random one-time addresses, and I use those to form a structure called a ring sometimes. And what I do is the ring signature is basically a way to say that I know the private key that corresponds to one of these output public keys in my ring. And what this really means is that I use the private wallet address that I hold, because of course those funds were originally addressed to my wallet address. I basically use that private key in order to generate the private key for one of these outputs. So again, that's that separation between wallet addresses and output addresses, which can be confusing from time to time. And effectively, a ring signature just says that I controlled one of those, and also that certain things involving the amounts end up balancing properly. So what happens is an outside person, whether or not Justin is the one, making this verification of the ring signature, or anyone who's, synchronizing the blockchain and ensuring that it all was done correctly, they of course need to know that all these signatures are valid and that I actually control the funds and that I'm actually signing them over to Justin. So in that case, you basically perform a verification of the ring signature, and all that verification tells that person is a couple of things. It tells them in particular, first, that one of those one-time addresses, those output one-time addresses, was the one that I controlled. Importantly, though, without revealing which one it is. So it says that one of them was, in this case, the true sender. So true sender in that case does not mean a wallet address. It means an output one-time address that was generated on the fly when funds were originally sent to me. And it also shows in particular that those funds weren't double spent. So kind of the cleverness of our ring signatures, they have a property called linkability. That means that if I were to grab another random ring and try to re-spend those funds, because remember, that particular one-time address, that output public key, that might appear in a bunch of other rings. Ideally, it will appear in a bunch of other rings when other people randomly grab it alongside their own. But I also need to make sure that that one wasn't spent twice. So the linkability property, which involves things like key images, lets us make sure that not only did I control one of those outputs, the one that I controlled was also not spent in another ring. So it's a lot of info kind of packed all into one structure called a ring signature. And as we're going to talk about, there are limitations to that, but mathematically, it does exactly what it says it's going to do. So effectively, I have plausible deniability. I could say to someone who says, well, one of those output public keys in that belonged to you. You could say, well, you don't know which one it was. And in particular, that output public key that I do control probably appears in a bunch of other rings, and I had nothing to do with those transactions. So it gives you some deniability about what was actually spent. That is, what public key I'm actually signing over to you effectively. We also have you also had kind of hinted at the idea of what are called heuristics too. And and heuristics are, it's kind of a subtle thing to talk about, but it's an important one, right? So, a good example of a heuristic, right, is let's say, for example, that I ask you to come up with a number between 1 and 10. And let's suppose that I ask you to write that number down, and I ask you to seal it up in an envelope so that I can't see it. So I turn around, you write down a number between 1 and 10, you seal it up in an envelope. I don't get to see it. Now, I, being a smart person who knows a little bit about, statistics and such, I happen to know that in general, people will typically not choose the number 1 or the number 10. It's actually true. People don't like the idea of like extreme values. So I think to myself, you probably didn't write down 1, and you probably didn't write down 10. In particular, I know that I think it's like 3 and 7 are the numbers that are most typically picked if someone asks you to pick a number between 1 and 10. So I might think to myself, aha, I bet you picked 7. And statistically, if we did this game over and over and over again, and you behaved like, a rational human being does, more often than not, you probably will pick the number 7 in there. But here's the thing. Unless you actually show me what that answer is, I have no idea if that's true or not. So effectively, what we would do in the kind of ring signature heuristic case is you would do this. You would write down your secret number. You would put it in the envelope. I would say to you, I think you picked the number 7. And instead of telling me, you just eat the envelope and walk away. That's a heuristic. Can I do anything with that information about you picking 7? I don't know. Maybe, maybe that has some significance in our real lives somehow, but it's not checkable. It's not provable. It's just me using information about how I think you're going to operate in order to gain some information that I might try to use. So there's kind of we're going to talk a lot about different heuristic approaches to ring signature analysis, but those things are not necessarily the same as any kind of proof. So that's important to keep in mind. There are a whole lot of different pieces of metadata and patterns of usage that we've iterated on over time that deal with heuristics. But it's important to remember when we say heuristics, we do not mean a proof. So can you do something with the heuristic? Absolutely. But is it provable? The answer is no. So ring signatures, when used in the ways that we're going to talk about correctly, do provide plausible deniability, even though an adversary could try to come up with heuristics over, in particular, what they might think the actual sender of a ring signature is. So it's important to remember, mathematically, ring signatures do exactly what they say on the box. They provide plausible deniability absent external information. But as we'll talk about, different kinds of external information can allow an adversary to, in Monero's early history, find out actual provable information, and later on in its history, determine heuristic information that's not necessarily provable.
No, I just really like that heuristic example because it helps keep things in perspective. So there's some things that probably break down your plausible deniability, things like zero decoy that we'll talk about in future episodes, where you can look completely based off Monero's on-chain data and say, based off this information, I know for sure that something occurred. For the heuristic case, you're using other information, but normally you need to have other information brought on the side in order to really corroborate this information and ground truth. To say that, yeah, this is sort of my guess, but I still can't check your envelope, right? I still can't go figure out what the ground truth is. Maybe your ground truth is talking to my friend who says that I always write down the number 7, and then you get closer, right? You get an additional piece of evidence to keep refining that heuristic further and further.
Right.
So I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between the way we talk about Monero's privacy in relation to plausible deniability, where we say, okay, at the minimum, we're making sure that you have, on the Monero blockchain, independent of anything else, you have plausible deniability. You have other information where it's not essentially a very clear path. Within the Monero ecosystem, you're sort of protected. But when you start throwing in a ton of outside real sort of information, it gets really complicated. And I think it's really hard for people to understand that, and that's why we're talking about it during the series.
Well, yeah, and it's something that you don't typically have to think about in real life. So it's something that's kind of artificially constructed when we deal with systems like this, but they are important to the security of those systems. So, and I mean, a lot of it also has to do kind of with your risk profile or your so-called threat model or threat profile, right? So, Monero's ring sizes today, for example, are 11. So if I'm sending funds to you, I choose my real, actual, the one that was destined to me, one-time address, and I take 10 fakes just off the chain, and I form a ring that's of size 11. So mathematically, absent any external information, if you were to guess which of those one-time outputs was actually the one being spent in my transaction to you, statistically, absent external information, you have a 1 in 11 chance. So, what does that actually mean in terms of real plausible deniability? If you're, dragged before some court or magistrate and they say, aha, we have somehow through external information figured out this one of the outputs in this ring belongs to you. Were you involved in some shady business? And you can say, well, mathematically, it's a 1 in 11 chance. Is that good enough for your use case? Well, that depends, right? I mean, it depends on the legal system and all sorts of other things that are, outside of kind of the mathematics of Monero in particular. Maybe that is a big deal. Maybe it's not. Before the episode, we talked about kind of an example where you said, well, okay, use the example of like Voldemort, right? Voldemort is a super bad guy in the Harry Potter universe, I'm told. Not a Harry Potter fan, but I'm told that this is true. So, perhaps Voldemort sees that one of your one-time output keys occurs in a ring and sees that, it is a 1 in 11 chance that that's yours. Or maybe the rings are even bigger someday and Voldemort sees that it's a 1 in 100 chance. Maybe under that threat model, Voldemort doesn't really care about the law and Voldemort just like casts a horrible spell of death on you anyway. Well, in that threat model, the fact that you were basically using Monero at all meant that you're kind of hosed. So, it really is dependent on your threat model. And that's not necessarily very comfortable to tell people, right? When you say, how much plausible deniability is enough plausible deniability for me? That is entirely dependent on your situation. As we'll talk about later too, we believe in the Monero community generally that the use of ring signatures when done correctly is the best current way, to safely use digital assets. So whether or not that applies to you really depends on your personal threat model. We believe that for most threat models, it's sufficient. But, always important to keep in mind the Voldemorts of the world, right? If the fact that you used Monero at all ends up somehow implicating you, then, well, that's a problem for you.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, Sarang, so much for that introduction. Sort of to re-summarize about ring signatures, they allow users to send transactions where the outputs or notes, as they're sometimes referred to, kind of like individual dollar bills, appear to come from more than one plausible location that can come from several. And without ring signatures, like you have with Bitcoin, it's really clear what source of funds is actually sent. But with Monero, we make that a bit ambiguous by saying it could have come from one of several places.
Right. In Bitcoin, they do in fact have a similar type of signature. The mathematics is different, but effectively you do the same thing where you basically sign, a note over to somebody else, in effect. Whereas Monero, you are signing on behalf of one of a possible group of notes to someone else. It's kind of a generalization.
Yeah. Would you say that like ring signature is used as a technology to hide where Monero is coming from is a good way to get the point across, or is it a little bit of a oversimplification?
I think it is, because when people say where it came from, I think they often assume that it has to do with wallet addresses. And remember, that is not the case. So to be absolutely clear, like your wallet address that you can look up on whatever Monero app you use, the really long one that usually starts with whatever, 4, for example, that never appears on the blockchain, ever, ever, ever. It is not mathematically possible, unless you tell someone additional information, for some random observer to look at transactions on the blockchain and determine what address they came from or were destined to. There is no way to do that. Instead, remember, you effectively generate one-time addresses, and those are the things that actually appear in rings and are signed for. So
yeah, so it's almost like when we say it hides where the funds are coming from, it's sort of
it's effectively another level of obfuscation that we often don't talk enough about.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. And then
and as we'll talk about later, if you interact with other entities like exchanges that have additional information, then they might be able to gain additional information. But you're not being silly about things. It is not possible to kind of make that linkage back again.
Mm-hmm. So I think we'll take the time now to talk about the histories of ring signatures in Monero, just so we can sort of see how things were and how we sort of addressed changes in the past in order to try and make them better and evolved in the past to previous major concerns of Monero. So ring signatures were made in sort of their current form, their similar form in 2004. And the original perceived use case for these were voting, where you would have several people vote, but you want to make sure that one person doesn't vote twice. They actually called these linkable ring signatures, not because you can trace who is voting, but you have the sort of key image component like we have in Monero to prove that someone isn't just selecting sources of possible votes and casting them multiple times. I believe that was sort of the initial thought process.
Yeah. When we talk about linkability in like this cryptographic construction sense, we're really saying, is it possible to link two signatures as having come from the same source, even if you don't know what that source is? So the idea of actually identifying what the signer was, it's a property called traceability. And there are many different constructions on how to do a ring signature. You can generate some that are traceable. You can generate some like we do that are linkable. So it's kind of it's a general type of cryptographic construction of which there are many examples. We use one that's very suited for what we want to do. But as you had said, there's many other applications that have been discussed, and I'm sure you could come up with many more if you sat down and thought about it long enough.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is the CryptoNote protocol, which was published in 14, though they allege it was published in 2012. It sort of took the idea and said, hey, instead of voting, let's make this used for sending transactions where we can make it appear that they're coming from several different stealth addresses. These outputs are coming from, the transactions are coming from several possible outputs instead of just clearly coming from one specific area. And this is a pretty novel application because it allowed you to do a sort of mixing process, but it did not require interactivity. So other systems at the time were
yeah, and that's actually very, very important, because part of the deniability is that one of the outputs that, I mean, if I'm sending an output to you, for example, that output is very likely to appear, under normal transaction volumes in many other people's rings. So ideally, the deniability comes from the fact that you can look at a bunch of different transactions, all of which reference, the output that I happen to secretly know about, and I can deny all of them in theory, because even though one of them may be the actual spend, it might not be. So it's very, very important that we have that property.
Yeah, and it just really helps with user experience too, that you can do things offline, or like you don't need to talk to someone or get someone else to work with you to sort of sign a transaction. I think that's one of the best. That's a reason why people were originally interested in ring signatures and the CryptoNote protocols, because you had this sort of, in one way, people sort of saw it as a non-interactive mixing, right?
Right. It is a non-interactive process. Yep. Yeah. You don't need the cooperation of anyone else whose outputs you're referencing in your own ring. Yep.
Sweet. So, Seren, can you take the time to walk through sort of the early years in Monero's history, from when it started to, I would say maybe through 2017 when Monero started adding ring CT, so up to ring CT.
Sure.
Can you talk about some of the like how well people really understood ring signatures? Were they well understood? Were people sort of speaking inaccurately about them? And can you walk us through some of the initial research you were doing to document some of these early limitations?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go and look at the CryptoNote white paper, you will actually see a linkable ring signature scheme that is not the linkable ring signature scheme that we use today. The scheme that we use is more efficient and has some other nice properties. It's based on a scheme that Joseph Liu came up with, which again, academic work, especially mathematics, builds off of other work. So questions of who invented this are, well, it's definitely the form that we use is a slightly modified version of a paper by Joseph Liu. The original one was more closely related to a different scheme that was in some ways less efficient and less useful to us. We can debate about the history of it in particular as much as we want to, but Monero did not invent this. The CryptoNote authors did not invent this. There's a novel application of some academic and mathematical and cryptographic work that had been done prior to that to start out with. So we basically use a scheme like that. We actually have modified it since, in particular because we need to integrate the ring CT scheme, which the basic structure of the ring signature is essentially the same, but there are some modifications that help us work with these encrypted amounts that aren't very important to what we're talking about today. But effectively, originally when this was used, ring signatures were basically optional. So in theory, you can have a ring of one possible signer. That is one possible note that I've plucked off of the chain, one possible one-time address, output address, whatever you want to call it, that I'm sending. In that case, there is no plausible deniability. If you know that one member of the ring had to sign and there is one member of the ring, it does not take a very smart bear to figure out what that signer was. And again, it was optional. We're like, optional transparency is good, right? And to some extent, Monero, we believe that you can always give information to someone about a transaction. That's always possible. So in some sense, optional transparency is in fact a good thing. But that made optional transparency very, very optional. So there was no minimum, there's no minimum ring size effectively, with the exception of one, of course. So we sometimes call these zero mix-in transactions. Another term we sometimes use for like the fake outputs that I'm pulling in are mix-ins, because they're fakes that I'm mixing in with my real one. I don't really like that term, but whatever. Mix-in 0 is ring size 1. Mix-in 1 is ring size 2, and so on and so on. But effectively with those, you had essentially you had no sender ambiguity in that sense. Remember, that still doesn't reveal the wallet address of the sender or the recipient because you don't have that information from the chain, but it did mean that there was no ambiguity in which of those nodes or outputs was actually the one being spent. So it was very quickly realized, though, that this was not necessarily a good thing. And we'll talk very, very briefly about this. We'll go into more, kind of you can call them attacks on this a little bit later on. Would you like us to talk a little bit about the zero mix-in problems as they apply to other larger rings?
So we'll have an entire episode on zero mix-in. So I would keep it
Sure.
very high level.
Sure. So again, even though having a zero mix-in or ring size 1 transaction removes sender ambiguity, you still have that extra layer of obfuscation caused by one-time addresses. So does it immediately identify you as the wallet address? No, it does not. We'll talk later about kind of how we at Monero Research Lab and other members of the Monero community and elsewhere, realized that there were other consequences to this. Because remember, a ring signature doesn't really exist in isolation on the chain. It uses outputs that are likely to occur in other ring signatures. So, in some sense, the actions that I take in some ways can affect the actions of other users' ring signatures too. And this is something that's kind of a constant theme throughout everything that we're going to talk about. And there are, in fact, other reasons why these zero mix-in transactions are bad. But at any rate, we realized that these zero mix-in transactions were bad. And after that, basically decided to start implementing minimum requirements. By minimum requirements, I mean, consensus enforced minimums. Not just that, oh, my wallet will by default show me that I should use a ring signature of 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever, but that if I do not send a transaction that has at least that many entries in the ring, it will be rejected by the network. So that's called consensus enforcement. So it will not be accepted by the network whatsoever. It is no longer optional. So that was instituted, and effectively we've over the years kind of iterated on larger and larger ring sizes to mitigate certain kinds of analysis that we're going to talk about. So eliminating the so-called zero mix-in or ring size 1 case was kind of the first step. But there are reasons that we'll talk about later why we continue to increase it over time. And I think you have a graphic, do you not?
I can pull that up real quick. Let me start sharing the screen real quick. So you can see here the sort of history based off of Monero's ring size. So you can see initially through 2014 through March of 2016, you could send those zero decoy transactions, the zero mix-in transactions, where you made it incredibly obvious. Like there's no possible way any other output could have been used in sending that transaction. There is only one that could be used. And so those, of course, had limiting privacy for those transactions. They were still protected with stealth addresses, but ultimately it was really obvious where they were coming from. But more importantly, these transactions also impacted the other transactions. We'll talk about the idea of chain reactions and such later. So in March 2016, Monero moved to a minimum ring size of 3. And then this was around for about a year and a half until September 2017 when it was raised to 5. And then in 2018, we learned about another attack we'll speak about, and so we raised it to 7. And then in 2018, we decided, let's preemptively bump it to 11 to take advantage, sort of split some of the benefits of bulletproofs to get better privacy and also better efficiency. So this chart, I think, does a pretty good job summarizing what happens up to this point. We started at 1, then we raised to 3, 5, 7. And then it's important to note that when we updated it to 11 in September of 2018, it is now a mandatory ring size. You previously could send other ring sizes, but now you can only send it with this exact ring size. So that's a quick history of Monero's ring sizes.
And as you had mentioned, prior to the most recent upgrade to a mandatory fixed ring size of 11, we only enforced minimum ring sizes. Absent other information, again, and there's certain kinds of analysis for which this is correct and certain kinds for which it's not. But for certain kinds of analysis, larger ring sizes to a point are in general better. You have, in theory, more plausible deniability. And as we'll talk about later, it can thwart other kinds of analysis as well. So, prior to very recently, you could make a ring as large as you want, and you would see occasionally just absurd numbers. I mean, what was the largest ring size we saw? It was, I want to say it was like over 1,000 or something.
It was over 1,000.
It was just absurd. And you could do this, it's going to cost you more in fees because the size of your transaction does go up as you increase ring sizes. You might say, well, why didn't we just immediately make rings gigantic all of a sudden? Well, you have to pay for that, unfortunately. The ring signature itself involves some cryptographic constructions that have to be stuck onto the chain with your transaction. That takes up space. Space is going to cost you in fees and in verification time as other folks download the chain and check it. So there are always trade-offs with this, particularly in terms of efficiency. So we'd like them to be as big as necessary, but not necessarily larger. And as you had said, when we decided to enforce the mandatory enforced ring size of 11, so right now, you cannot send a transaction with any ring size besides 11. It will be rejected by the network. That was also to reduce distinguishability. If for whatever reason you always decide to use, I don't know, ring size 69 as a random example, then if someone sees one transaction on the chain eventually with ring size 69, they'll be like, oh, that must be that ring size 69 guy. Huh, must be sending something to someone. So that's not good for distinguishability. In general, transactions should look as identical as possible. So it was done to reduce distinguishability with the idea that there are certain kinds of analysis we'll talk about later for which a larger ring size is not necessarily that valuable. So that's why they've increased. They're all prime numbers, which I had not realized until someone said, oh man, is there some deep mathematical reason why all the ring size increases are prime numbers? I was like, no. Like, oh, but surely you meant it as a math joke, right? It's like, no, I did not. Maybe some other people saw it, but I didn't. I felt foolish. I've studied math for a long time, but I don't know. I couldn't see the prime numbers for the trees.
No.
So anyway, that's where our ring sizes are now. And again, some of the changes were made, coinciding with, for example, the ring CT deployment. And ring CT deployment was when we made some fairly major changes to also hide amounts of transactions. In some sense, we can also talk about the fact that that was very good too, because prior to that, how you had to do ring signatures was kind of a little bit wonky. So if I was sending 123 Monero prior to the ring CT deployment, what you basically do is kind of break them up almost like you break up dollar bills, right? So I'd have kind of like 100 Monero note or output. I might have, a couple 10 Monero notes, for example, and some 1 Monero notes. You can kind of denominate them however you want. It's up to you when you come up with your own Monero clone, right? And so what you would effectively do is for that 100 Monero note, you would go and pull, a bunch of other 100 Monero notes together and kind of make a ring with those and so on. So it was kind of this like, I don't know, useful at the time, but fairly wonky approach where you had to kind of just pull based on denomination. So there were some impacts on this too, where if you have very small amounts, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to find necessarily, equally denominated amounts, as part of this big pool of denominated notes and stuff. It kind of became a mess, and it's not great for analysis because, it's dependent on the denominations that other folks are sending, and that's not great. So the ring CT deployment was fantastic for many reasons, but one of them was there are no more amounts in Monero transactions. You can't see what they are. That doesn't mean you can make up numbers. The math does all have to check out, and that's part of why we had to kind of alter our ring signatures a bit, is to make that work. But it did mean that now instead of having to worry about, oh man, how many 100 Monero outputs are there that I can kind of hide among my ring, that doesn't matter anymore. You can just arbitrarily choose these, post ring CT outputs and build a ring out of them. So it's pretty fantastic. It's great for a lot of reasons. Better for efficiency. It's a lot better for distinguishability, and it effectively makes the pool of outputs from which you can choose from, as kind of as wide as possible within the ring CT environment.
Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of discovery process before the first Monero Research Lab papers were published? Was it well known that Monero had limitations, or did someone say, hey, people with PhDs or PhD candidates, look at this and find if you can break it? How did that sort of process work in the early days?
So it was fairly well known that there were limitations to this, in particular because the blockchain introduces structure, right? So on its own, as like this beautiful mathematical ideal, a linkable ring signature does exactly what it says in the box, right? It provides, perfect plausible deniability of the sender in a particular, in general, it can be any kind of message. We use it for transaction messages, right? So in kind of its own little environment, it's ideal and it has great provable security properties, and we absolutely love it. But the second that you start introducing structure into the blockchain, and by structure, I mean, we have like an ordering of transactions. We know that certain outputs, might be chosen in different ways based on how you're randomly choosing the outputs for your ring signature. Some people might interact with exchanges, which may have some information about what they've been doing. When we had denominated amounts, there was a lot of information about amounts that you were sending, if you're sending the same amount every time. anytime that you are able to glean any little bit of information, any kind of structure, any kind of metadata, that's not good. That is something that an adversary might be able to use to generate either some kind of provable analysis or some kind of heuristic, which, as we said, is basically an unprovable guess based on, supposed behavior. So some of those things were known. They weren't necessarily formalized right away. They are kind of documented in some, it's very, very hip these days to publish a paper on some little part of Monero analysis. And in MRL, we get sent papers, often of not the highest quality, talking about some little part of Monero's analysis, often involving ring signatures. But in the early days, we didn't really have a lot of that. Some of the Monero Research Lab papers, the numbers are I always forget the numbers, I think it's 1 and 4, talk about some of those early analyses, one of which involves things involving zero mixin transactions, how that interacted with some of the earlier kind of pre-ring CT denominated amount stuff. And some other ones also had to do with some so-called chain reaction attacks that we'll be talking about, I believe, in the next episode or a later episode. So it's very much kind of an ongoing process. And, part of why I like the fact that Monero is able to kind of iterate so well with its, regular network upgrade schedule is that we can take into account some of these things that are found and iterate on them. An asset, for example, like Bitcoin, that doesn't really have to worry about this. Bitcoin is about as transparent as you can possibly get. There's really no privacy concerns in that sense on which they have to iterate. But for something like Monero, the analyses aren't going to get worse. The analyses that people do are only going to get better. And that's not a bad thing. When folks do publish work, whether or not it's high quality, I like to see it because I like to know that we can use that information to make Monero better. But it also means that it's very helpful that we can iterate so rapidly. As you saw in that chart, ring size goes up because we learn about different forms of analysis that we want to avoid, among other things that we iterate on.
Cool. So given that we've sort of improved Monero's ring size in the past, and we've sort of covered most of the at least basic forms of attack that we're concerned about, do you still think that ring signatures remain one of Monero's greatest limitations?
In terms of limitations, I would say yes, but primarily in the sense of like an annoyance. That if you're going to do any kind of analysis on Monero, and again, there's plenty of papers out there, some of which are great, some of which I think are pretty low quality. A lot of them will deal with analysis that comes out of the fact that ring signatures provide a limited anonymity set. So, if I know that one of 11 outputs was spent and generated some output, which itself was used as one of a bunch of different rings, again, that invites structure, and that structure invites analysis. And it is surprisingly difficult to avoid all possible heuristics. So if someone points out, my goodness, there's a heuristic there, I'm like, yeah, anytime you have structure, you're going to be able to come up with, some kind of metric that you might use to try to make informed guesses about, what output a true sender is. And generally, if you're using Monero well, that doesn't really have a practical impact on your privacy, but it's still something we want to avoid because, again, attacks don't get worse, they only get better over time. So I would say that it is the biggest source of annoyance. I've long been an advocate of, someday we will get rid of ring signatures and it will be a good thing if we do it correctly. And I still think that is absolutely the case. A lot of what we do ends up being analysis surrounding that. And, it's a good thing that we're using our time that way, but if we could move on to something that's better in terms of sender anonymity and ambiguity, we could use our time elsewhere. That might be nice.
Sorry, unmute myself now. So given that, why hasn't Monero sort of tried to move on to one of these other systems? It doesn't seem to be developing one of these other systems yet. Mm-hmm. Is it just that ring signatures are sort of still the best thing we're aware of now, or what are the given circumstances?
Yeah, so like I had said before, for some kinds of analysis, not all of them, larger ring sizes are better. And I kind of use larger ring size as kind of a proxy for sender anonymity sets. And again, sender anonymity does not mean wallet addresses. It means kind of these one-time addresses. So there's an additional layer of obfuscation there. I always like to mention that when I can. But again, making just arbitrarily large ring sizes, while it would help some attacks and analyses, is hugely cost ineffective. So for example, if we went from ring size 11 to like ring size 1,000, so your output is one of 1,000 that you just plucked off of the chain, for example, that is going to be a very, very large transaction and is going to be fairly expensive to generate that ring signature, because when you do a transaction, part of the time it takes is actually generating this cryptographic ring signature structure. And it means that everyone else who downloads the blockchain pays for that space and also for the time it takes to verify that that was done correctly. They're very small amounts of time, like on the order of tens or hundreds of milliseconds per transaction to verify that the ring signature is correct, and that's important to do. But that really adds up, right? When you have a few million transactions, and everyone says, "My God, why is it so slow to do blockchain validation?" That's part of it. Those little times add up over time. So some things would be made better if we could do that, but unfortunately, we don't know a way to make a very, very large ring signature that is also efficient. There are some schemes that have been proposed for doing similar, linkable ring signatures in ways that would let us make the rings very large, like on the order of 1,000, without taking up that much space. But unfortunately, mathematically, you have to pay for that with verification time. So the answer to that is like, can we make ring sizes bigger? Not without paying, some horrible consequence, right? There's always like a horrific catch to it. And that's the horrific catch for that. Like you kind of hinted at, there are other schemes that do not use ring signatures at all for sender ambiguity and anonymity. So for example, like the Zero Coin and Zero Cash projects, those have effectively as large of anonymity set as you could possibly get. That is, their anonymity sets are effectively every single note or output or whatever they call it that has been placed onto the chain. Now, how that interacts with other forms of privacy, like amounts and, for example, recipient anonymity and privacy, that depends on the particular scheme, right? So, for example, the original Zero Coin paper was one of these proposals that would have had a large anonymity set, but you didn't have any control over amounts. You can only send like unit amounts. It was designed as kind of like a Bitcoin lottery. Cool, I guess, but they paid for it in other ways. In particular, by not being able to have particular amounts, and also trust comes into play a lot. So the Zero Cash project, for example, of which Zcash is kind of a modified instantiation, that kind of solved the Zero Coin problem by allowing you to do arbitrary amounts. If you've used the Zcash system, for example, you can send whatever amount you want, kind of like in Monero, and you do get a very large anonymity set if you stay within this Zcash so-called shielded pool of fairly private transactions. But in that case, they pay for it originally in terms of generating the proofs involved with that. They, while being very, very small, which is good on the blockchain, took a long time to generate. So they paid for it in that sense. And they also paid for it in the now probably famous or infamous, depending how you look at it, Zcash multi-party computation, or why am I blanking on the word they use for that? The ceremony, right? Where the Zcash instantiation of this big proving system that lets them do all this fancy math involved some computation that you had to basically trust that the folks who did it were not compromised, or at least that one of them was not compromised. So there's always these limitations, right? Ideally, we want something that has very, very large sender anonymity. We also want something that allows us to do arbitrary amounts, for example, like Monero and Zcash do. We also want something ideally that doesn't require me to trust that a group of people did some original ceremony correctly, because maybe I trust them, but maybe I don't. And I also want to make sure that that's efficient, right? Originally I couldn't use, for example, a phone to do a shielded Zcash transaction because it took a long time, even though they were able to have very small proofs. Whereas in Monero, we can do stuff pretty quickly, but if I want to increase that ring size, I got to pay for it in terms of space and a little bit in terms of time. So the answer to that, to make a long story a slight bit longer, is that there is nothing right now that gives us everything that I want. And that's a very hot topic of academic research right now, is how to get rid of some of those things that we don't like. I am personally of the opinion that if you cannot accept trust in a centralized party, like the Zcash company or whoever, then Monero is probably your best option right now for getting reasonable sender ambiguity. But again, someday, ideally, we'll be able to get all of those things that we want, and I would love to move to that if it works for us.
Excellent. So are there any other final thoughts you want to have in this sort of initial introduction to ring signatures and like their history before we move on in future episodes to the specific attacks on them and other aspects of Monero?
I'm trying to see in my notes if there's anything else. Yeah, I mean, the gist of it, I think, is really that they do what they say on the box, but blockchains introduce structure. So that's where a lot of our annoyances come from. The process has definitely been iterative, but that's because that we've been learning over time, what's the ways you can use external information and that structure that's introduced by the blockchain and people's interactions with it, that those things are what give us the problem. So when you might kind of flippantly say, oh, ring signatures have all these problems. Well, like, not really. Like the structure itself, like the cryptographic ideal mathematical construction, that you can read about in the academic literature, does exactly what it says it's going to do. The ring signature itself is not broken. What it does do, though, is it introduces this structure, and that structure allows for all different kinds of analysis that give you varying levels of annoyance and that we try to iterate on. It's very much like a belt and suspenders and second belt and gluing the pants to yourself kind of thing, right? Where we try to iterate on things that we think could potentially be, any kind of a problem for our users, in order to improve privacy to the extent possible. Like we said in the first episode, privacy is not a switch you flip on or off. It's very much dependent on your threat model, on the risk you're willing to take, and the particular kinds of analysis that we think are going to be relevant to our users. So it's all a compromise, right? Anyone who claims that they figured this out without compromise either doesn't know what they're talking about or does and is just full of shit. So we do, I think, the best that we can do, given the limitations that we know our users are willing to accept.
And so to leave us to the last comment, is there any sort of risk, like there's one major risk that users should sort of avoid, one action users can do to avoid the majority of risks? What would that really be?
So I guess, right. So I think I would say that in general, probably the most issues that might come up for users end up when you interact with an entity that has more information about you, right? So kind of the big classic example for this is exchanges, right? It would be fantastic if I could pay my rent in Monero and do all this kind of stuff using Monero in a way that wouldn't necessarily require me going to a regulated exchange and converting to fiat currency and stuff. But I also understand that's not the world we live in. And if I'm going to pay my rent, I'm probably going to do that in my local currency. And that will likely, depending on where I live, involve me going to a regulated exchange that may know, for example, information about my Monero address. It could involve information about me personally and where I live and all sorts of personal data. And interactions with those entities are things that could cause problems, if done repeatedly or, kind of flippantly, or in ways that you are worried might kind of turn evil later on. So if you are very, very worried, if you have a threat model that would not necessarily allow that, then maybe giving your name, address, personal identification numbers and things to a regulated entity might not be for you. But, I would say for the majority of reasonable use cases that I think we tend to consider on a day-to-day basis, Monero does an excellent job of that, and its recent iterations have gotten a lot better. So ring signatures, I wouldn't say worry me, they annoy me.
Mm-hmm. All right. So with that annoyance, thanks, Sarang, for your insight today.
It's gonna get so much more annoying when we go into details on particular annoyances. This has been very purposely vague, I'll say today, and we're going to talk a lot more about different kinds of analysis, both historic and kind of modern day,
Absolutely.
as we continue on the series.
This has really helped to set the stage for everyone who's sort of relearning about Monero's history or being reintroduced into it, and then also understanding ring signatures on a high level and sort of how Monero researchers approach them, because they've been a source of annoyance for many years now, and a lot of focus as far as research and development is concerned. All right.
Yeah, and I mean, if any of the viewers want to know more, if they're a little bit more mathematically inclined and want to know a bit more about the details of how they work, resources. Zero to Monero is kind of a fairly well endorsed technical guide to how Monero works, and you can see that at the Monero website. And that does have, I think, a really good explanation of the math behind the rig signatures if you want to understand that. You won't really have to understand that to understand the rest of the episodes, but if you want more details, they are available.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope that this episode of Breaking Monero will help you understand more about these ring signatures. And it's really critical that you understand at least the basics for the rest of the series. So again, thanks, Sarang, for being here with me today. Thanks for you, the viewer, for watching today's episode. And we hope to have you watch future episodes, especially those where we get far more granular on specific attacks that people are worried about. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
See ya.
Man, that was quite about a lot of detail.
Yes, it was. One quick comment before we jump in for a short moment and discuss it, because I know that we've gone really over time, but that is a basque of information that needs to be out there. And people need to learn this stuff if you're willing to drive towards that notion of truly divorcing yourself from the monetary monopoly. But one comment, though, I like how dude has in his backdrop has the stack of Catan tabletop boxes. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What a nerd.
I'd
Catan is
like
awesome.
just to comment, he's talking about we're talking about structure here. This
Yep.
refers back to something I remember seeing Roger Ver say on one of his interviews. With the whole purpose of the cryptocurrency environment is to reintroduce law and order to the internet, because right now anybody can go and get a pirated copy of X, Y, and Z, and they tried to fix that with like Apple Music and stuff like that and Spotify,
Mm.
and to a certain extent they've been able to be successful, but they're not. It's not a universal solution. Cryptocurrency is an effort to create a universal solution on the internet, so that whatever you do, if you're let's tie this step back into real life. Everyone knows about Amazon and Overstock. Everyone knows about Kmart and Sears, and how one chased the other out of the market. The same thing goes with Netflix and Blockbuster, Hollywood Video. This kind of structure that they're trying to re-implement over the internet would make it so that the traditional brick and mortar stores would be able, on the same playing level as an Amazon or an Overstock. Just something to think about. I know you have a bunch of things that you wrote down you wanted to talk about. So,
You know me, man. Look at me. I'm the media now. Speaking of structure, though, one short comment. Let's dive into it for a quick minute. Explain exactly what plausible deniability is within the Monero community.
well, I mean, it's like, say you go to you go out into town to go shopping, right? You go to the bookstore, and you want to buy a book, but it's a little spicy. You don't want people to know that you are the person that bought it, but you also want to contribute to the fact that yes, there's a market for this particular book.
Andrew,
That's what they're talking about.
Hold on. Are you buying porn with Monero? Is that your
No.
admittance? I had to bring that joke in, everybody. But no, go on.
Well, I'm just saying this content, this people want to show that there is a market for content, but they don't want to
Absolutely.
be directly associated with it. So
Absolutely. You want to keep your anonymous behavior anonymous. Nobody wants to. I mean, it's a market. Not everybody wants everybody to be in their business. Doesn't matter what you're shopping for.
it's extremely expensive to be 100% transparent all the time. You're not in a position to do that if you want to keep a reputation.
Exactly. It's all about reputation. So the next one is actually, and this is going to sound a little humorous, but there's a lot of mathematics involved in I hate to say algorithm, use the word algorithm, but the algorithm of the coding towards the Monero chain, and how it works. Are humans, are the normies prepared for that? I mean, I understand, like, towards the end, he said, if you want to learn more, check out 0 to Monero over on Monero's website, which you still can, by the way. Learn a little bit and then follow this series that they released about 6 years ago, Breaking Monero. But are the normies prepared for the math? Basically, can normies math? Does the math calculate?
There are people who run prison blocks and prison cells all throughout the world who are trying to manually mine Bitcoin because they've got the manpower through the people that are in prison, and they don't have anything to do with their time.
Yep.
It's realistically possible, but it's not pragmatic.
So, speaking of the privacy apparatus, though, because one thing that I wrote down that they mentioned was the concept of a one-time blockchain address when in use And let's explore just for a moment what that means in kind of disguising or anonymizing or obfuscating your wallet address.
Okay, so say you have Windows, right? And you have a hardware wallet.
Hmm.
You would associate that address with the hardware wallet, and either people can. It's obviously, like I said, it's a part of the ring signature. They can send it for the one-time use to that address, or you can mine on the computer and have it sent to the address. If that answers your question.
Good, good. Not just for me, but for the audience, of course. So they explored. Obviously, this was an introduction to ring signatures. They're going to get more in depth into it. I imagine they've hinted at it as we explore the remainder of the series and go on.
Most
But can
videos
you?
are not this long. This one was one of the few that were exceptionally long. You'll have to forgive us.
Oh, of course. I mean, we could have brought that up at the outro, but they discuss ring signatures. Let's. What exactly is a ring signature, and is it a good or a bad thing for Monero,
Well,
or
it
is it
says
kind of
the
neutral?
ring signature is a security implementation for people that want to be able to, this might be my wallet address, this might not, this
Mm.
might be my key, this might not. You have it's all about how granular you want to look into the background of the person that you're trying to trace.
So it's a security feature. Does that help the normies that want to get involved? And it's just kind of a nuisance to those that are in depth into Monero as is already, or could that potentially attempt in
It's not
these
a it's not
in
a
centralizing
it's not a
the chain?
nuisance. What it is like I said before, it's a mechanism for security. It helps ring signatures. The more, like I just showed on that graph, the more that you increase the number, the more secure it is. But at the same time, it becomes more difficult to confirm those transactions because they take longer.
Just
It's
like Bitcoin, except for that, is there fees attached to
well,
this that just get
there's not a free market like in
extravagant?
Bitcoin Core. This it's a different implementation.
Of course, of course. Um, Considering it's effectively off of a different chain. Um, Now, one last thing: linkability and traceability. What's the difference?
Well, linkability that goes to the back to the ring signatures.
Hmm.
Traceability, you need to have like a man in the middle attack. So somebody that that confirms, not in the middle in the sense of the miner, the people that run the node, the public node that people connect and operate off of. And there's multiple. It's kind of like the Onion router network, the Tor network.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's always a chance that you're gonna get popped because the exit node knows exactly what the last server was, but
Hmm.
the way that it operates, it hops from computer to computer, so it's incredibly difficult to try to trace somebody down, but it's not impossible. It's all about trying to find out the heuristics, as they talked about at the very beginning of the video, about
Hmm.
the person that you're trying to trace.
And then one final question, Andrew, and you might actually be flustered at this one. Um, is is Monero only for skinheads?
No.
You know what? You know why I asked, right?
What's that? Oh,
Are you
are you
serious?
implying? Are you
I'm
implying that I'm a skinhead?
I'm implying that there's a lot of baldness from that video to this video.
Well, I mean that's true. But
So,
no, for example, Kenny, uh, is a gentleman who we watch on YouTube ourselves. He's an African American. He's from Georgia, and he's got a lot of content on Monero. So
Why'd you have to bring race into this?
I wasn't trying to bring race into it. I was just trying to,
Why
give
does it
context.
why does it matter that he's an African American, dude? He's a human being.
I know that.
Are you a shitlip
I suppose I am.
or a conservative? It doesn't matter. Both sides use race to achieve their goals. No, but really, actually,
DEI.
speaking of,
Zach
DEI.
Zach has a DEI policy. That's why I'm here.
You're fired. There is no DEI here. You're fired. Goodbye, Andrew. Andrew has been fired. He might get rehired for later this week when we come back at 11 p.m. Or no, not 11 p.m. That's way too late. Wow. At 11 a.m. Eastern on Friday when we come back to the Weekly Legacy. Weekly Legacy episode 4, Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Episode 4 returns. We are going to be back at it in the daytime. The last 3 weeks have been very fun, but very exhausting. Get the hell out of here. No, you're fired. So
What about World
no.
Blockchain Roundtable?
I'll get to that. You're fired. But yeah, Thursday that will be Friday. The Legacy Right live at 11 a.m. for the Weekly Legacy. We return, and of course, don't miss every Thursday the World Blockchain Roundtable. Also at 11 a.m. Eastern, live on YouTube, X, and just chime in, join the chats, join the comments. And just listen to a fantastic conversation that dives into another aspect of the crypto world. All right, Andrew, you're rehired. Any last words?
Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, drop a comment, join the conversation, and I hope you're enjoying what we're trying to do here every Wednesday for Crypto Wednesday. We're exploring breaking Monero, and I know we ran a little long. That's not going to be the case every Wednesday. This was just a very long video, but it needs to be out there, and we want to decipher it, and we want you to watch it with us. So until next time, everybody, see you on Thursday on the World Blockchain Roundtable, and see you on Friday for brunch, for coffee and brunch at 11 a.m. Eastern as well. Peace and live long and prosper.